Hello everybody, this is Fun Police and I'm back with another Cards deck tech. Today we're taking a look at a pretty interesting deck. With the recent balance patch that just came out a couple days ago, we have seen a massive resurgence in US ramp as several of the cards were changed to essentially buff the deck. However, I have taken it in a different direction and have come up with a pretty interesting deck in German ramp. The idea behind this is that the newly buffed cards of United We Stand and the 332nd Engineer Regiment are much more effective ramp tools when they are as ally slots. So we're able to fit in a lot of extra utility into our ally slots, allowing us to play ramp without having to fully commit to a US play style. And Germany makes a natural fit due to its abundance of high value elites that can make for very good targets to ramp into. One of the biggest things that this deck also benefits from is that our large pool of German cards allows us to be very good at anti-aggro. In fact, this deck feels insanely powerful against most aggro decks. It's got a decent amount of healing and a little bit of guard, but the biggest effect is that we just have so many ways to constantly blow up everything the enemy has. Single target removal, board clears, you name it. And that's one of the greatest strengths that this might have over the standard US ramp deck, in that you're able to be almost unbeatable against a aggro deck, whereas normally ramp often struggles a bit because it is lacking in early game interaction. Without further ado, let's start looking over the cards. So we're going to start out with looking at many of the removal orders within this deck, because most of our early game is just essentially removal. But I want to make a note that this is a bit open to customization, mainly because the meta changes and things change depending on where you are on ladder. But you should not just copy this removal package one for one, because there are many options, especially in Germany, that could fit into a variety of strategies and just help you deal with whatever you're facing. At the moment, I've had it set up like this and I found this to be relatively well balanced, but you might want to lean into a little bit more of a certain removal type if you're facing problems with certain decks. So to start out, we have a single copy of Through the Breach. So Through the Breach is a pretty basic 1 credit removal order. It's essentially a small tactical strike, and it's a decent one-of. I don't like a whole many copies of this, but being able to, for 1 credit, potentially remove something in the back line or potentially just ping something off on that one last health point has been really nice. It's a very good, cheap game early. It's a very good interaction in the early game. We also have Lurking Danger. Lurking Danger is a pretty useful draw spell. It's essentially it's 1 credit to draw 2 cards as long as they're countermeasures, and we're able to fit in a small package of countermeasures as early game removal. So Lurking Danger fits very nicely as essentially 1 credit draw 2. We also have the ARADO AR 196. This is a cheap draw order. Also a very effective early game drop. It's very easy to get this guy to draw a card off of you, and a 1 credit 1/2 that drew you a random order. And because of our deck, orders are very often removal. The ARADO is just very good at helping boost our consistency in finding answers to enemy threats early on. Then we have the 1096 VOLKSGRENADIERs, or 1097th, my apologies. These guys are the only guards that is actually available in either Germany or the US. So the 1097th serves as a very useful way to have some proactive guards that come onto the board. A 2/5 for 2 credits is honestly quite durable, and it does provide a good wall against many aggro decks. Even something like US Frontline often can't effectively punch through it without really committing resources to it. So these guys are actually pretty good overall. Although granted, they are quite weak against slower decks. Then we have missing. This is one of our 2 countermeasures. Missing is a pretty powerful order. If you can time it correctly, this can be a very strong way of removing high value targets, namely stuff like big untargetable tanks or massive guard infantry. Those can be very difficult to remove sometimes, and missing helps to give us a consistent way to remove them. We also have From the Deep. From the Deep is a very effective countermeasure, probably one of the best just out there, period. And From the Deep, just, 2 credits, you blow up an enemy unit when they get play it. If you time it correctly, you can hit something high value, or at least force the enemy to play something else beforehand, making their turn more awkward. Just overall really good. We have the HEINKEL HE-115. This is just a solid early game play. It's a 1-2 blitz bomber, so for 3 credits you're getting to ping something, and you're also getting a Spoils of War in hand, so you get to draw extra cards and dig for answers or threats as you need it. You'll notice that many of these early units are often feeding into giving our deck better consistency, more draw, fetching orders, being able to kind of tutor our hand, and that helps a lot with us having so much removal. We're able to always have removal in hand and always be able to deal with threats. We have next up United We Stand. This has become a very, very powerful card. 2 credits, deal 2 damage is a pretty standard baseline. Being able to also potentially ramp with a free War Machine on top of that is just very, very powerful. You'll definitely see in the games today, this card is kind of nutty against aggro, and even though it's a bit more awkward to use against control, usually you're going to be able to find a use for it. Very, very effective card overall. We got 2 tactical strikes within the deck. Always been kind of a decent removal card, and fits well within this deck, allowing us a flexible way to set up stuff like United We Stand in order to help finish off even bigger threats. Tactical Strike just has a very nice utility role, dealing with mid-sized threats on its own, or setting them up to be pinged off by one of our numerous cheap orders. We also have 3 copies of FLAMMPANZER. This is like one of the best anti-aggro cards in the game. You get a decent 3/3 body out on the board, and you get to immediately blow up an enemy unit. That's cost 1 or less, and most aggro decks are playing a lot of 1-drops nowadays. FLAMMPANZER almost always is going to have a target, and even against slower decks, a 3/3 tank is just a small proactive play, so it's never a dead card, and that makes FLAMMPANZER really, really good. We have REICH RESEARCH. REICH RESEARCH is both early game removal, but also is potentially powerful end game. Most notably, the U-boat is very, very powerful, as it is kill an enemy unit and they discard 2. But because we're ramp, we can even go into Uran Project, which is just kill all enemy units. That's a very effective board clear, and gives us a board clear that we otherwise don't have a whole lot of in this deck. It is very slow, but in grindy games, it can absolutely matter. Then we have the 332nd Engineer Regiment. These guys also were recently buffed. Although their body is a bit weaker, they now give us a bit of defense, and because of that, we can actually have a bit of healing within this deck that gives us just enough wiggle room in order to be able to survive against enemy burn or not run out of health too quickly, which is a normal problem that slower German decks run into. On top of that, it is still ramping us, so we're getting that multiple utility for 1 card slot, which is very, very nice. The PANZER III-H is also in here. Again, it is a relatively cheap play, and you have a body, and then you are digging up cards from your deck. Very similar to the HE-115 or ARADO, in just being able to help filter our deck and find us what we need when we need it. Root Out the Enemy is the next order. This was buffed a little while ago to permanently affect units, and that makes this actually a lot stronger against aggro decks because it leaves the enemy units permanently crippled. It's overall a very effective tool. Essentially, it's 4 credits, deal 2 damage to everything, and that's a very decent board clear. Helps clear out many early game drops, and anything that survives is now a little bit less of a threat. There's many cards that often end up at 0 attack or just 1 attack and become kind of non-threats, allowing you to remove them at your leisure. We also have 2 copies of We Can Do It. At first, I did not have We Can Do It in the deck. However, I feel like we just needed a little bit extra healing in order to make this deck functional. So I've had to make a few cuts from previous lists in order to make We Can Do It fit. But I do think that the effects overall were positive for the deck. It also helps us by having a little more card draw. This deck is very good at just constantly having a hand of cards. It very rarely runs out, and that's a very nice aspect of it. We also have the JU-88G6. This is one of our value cards. At 5 credits, it's not particularly massive, but it is decently statted, and if it's able to kill even 1 or 2 enemy units, the JU-88G6 can generate a lot of value and just give us multiple threats for a single card. We also have the Focke-Wulf 190 JAGDBOMBER. Very just solid tool overall, good tempo. You can bounce any enemy ground unit. This can be things like guards if you're actually pressuring the enemy, but it can also just be to get something really scary out of the front line and send it back to hand, slowing the enemy down. Very flexible, very good overall. We have 2 copies of War Bonds also. This is the additional ramp that is within the deck. It is also additional card draw on top of that extra ramp, so we're able to again get utility from this card in multiple ways. We're getting the extra credits, but we're also drawing more cards. Then we have Gathering Storm. Gathering Storm is a big end tutor card. Due to the way the deck is set up, very often you're going to be drawing pretty selective options. Each set essentially only has a few outcomes, and that helps to make the deck very consistent at finding kind of what you need when you need it. This honestly could maybe be cut. The deck does have a lot of draw in other circumstances, and Gathering Storm is quite expensive. So I think you could maybe consider cutting that for more removal, or maybe some other defensive tool, or maybe even just a big threat on its own. Then we have a single copy of the TBF-1 Avenger. This was a card I originally was running 2 copies of. However, because I felt like we needed some We Can Do It's within the deck, I've ended up trimming this down to 1 copy, and it honestly has not been that bad so far. Avenger is definitely very powerful. It's no doubt a great ramp target, but it's not always going to hit something, and the body itself is not as strong as other units. So although definitely very nice, and I'm glad we have 1 copy to selectively pick something off, we have a lot of ways to remove enemy units that something like the Avenger is not as crucial. Then we have the Tiger 1E, very, very powerful endgame threat. Easily the best thing to do with the Tiger 1E is try to hold it until very late in the game, or when the enemy has run themselves out of cards, because if the Tiger doesn't get removed by like a deployment order or gets blown up by a random like board clear, it'll just win the game on its own because it's so difficult to deal with. And as such, it is just very, very powerful and fits well as one of our endgame threats. We also have the ME262. This is another standout card for Germany. You are getting essentially a board clear on top of a 7/5 fighter. Insanely good against a deck like US Ramp. Also against like British Air, can also deal high damage. Overall, just a very, very effective tool, and if timed correctly, this alone can sometimes win you matchups. Then we have 2 copies of the B-17 Flying Fortress. This is the standard US ramp thing everybody's ramping into, and for good reason. It is a pretty it is a pretty real threat at a 5/5 bomber on top of the heavy armor, makes it quite durable, and then you also get the random destruction effect on it. You're able to often get a 2-for-1 out of this, and it helps to just give you that extra punch. And finally, to round things out, Leopold. This is just like, one of those great cards, where especially when you're ramping into Leopold and getting this out on like turn 6 or turn 7, Leopold can win some games. Not always, but there are times that Leopold does save you by locking down the board, especially against something like aggro decks or mid-range decks. If this comes out quickly enough, it can sometimes just be something they can't deal with, and you end up winning because of it. And that's the deck. Again, it's a very interesting deck, and I'm still definitely tinkering with it. So if I make any revisions before this video goes live, they'll be down in the description. Make sure to check down there for the most recent deck code of this. But otherwise, this is currently what I have. Let's simply talk about maybe some additional options within the deck. Probably one thing that you could absolutely consider is potentially looking into the Panther cards, namely the Panther G. Because we're ramping, we're able to better operate this relatively expensive unit, and it is a very powerful threat against slower decks. Combined especially with something like the Tiger 1E and our various other late games, the Panther G helps you to potentially nudge up your threat density a bit, which is something that can run a bit slim if you're wasteful with it. I've definitely had a few games where I've just been outgrinded by really greedy decks because I've overcommitted in the board clears or walked into obvious traps, so the Panther Gs could help you offset that a little bit. You could also consider the Tiger 1H. This guy doesn't see as much play, but he is just kind of a big dumb threat. And because we're ramping into him, he could potentially come out relatively early. I think it's maybe a bit lower on the power scale, but it is maybe something that could be worked in. You could also consider the PANZERZUG. After it's reworked to summon 2 PANZERGRENADIERs, especially because of our ramp, you could honestly make a very good argument for this. It's 3 bodies in 1, could definitely help with the threat density. I think honestly that is a good option to really consider within the deck. You also got the Comet, which is a very, very good late game threat. It is expensive, but we do have ramp to help afford it every turn, and it will repeatedly damage the enemy HQ and kind of give us an inevitability that can be really useful. Again, I think there's definitely a lot of room for improvement and changes. For example, maybe we want to cut these JU-88s, and maybe the Comet and PANZERZUG are better to ramp into. Although that does maybe leave us with a lot of expensive plays and not a lot to do if we don't hit war bonds. So maybe you have to change that around and fit in a 3rd war bond. So there's a lot to really consider. There is also some other options for removal. Sudden Strike is potentially quite good. A very blanket card that blows up enemy units. It's very similar to FLAMMPANZER, although it is a little more flexible since it has 2 credits, but it doesn't have a body, so it's usually a little bit worse. You could also consider even something such as Annihilation. Because we're ramping, this could be relatively easy to afford. And although it maybe is a bit awkward in control matchups, usually there's smaller units that control decks are playing, and being able to kill one and make the enemy discard is an effective 2-for-1 that could help you grind. It could be a legitimate option. And then in countermeasures, Careless Talk is always a potential option. Very cheap, but able to kill pretty much all early game units. You also could potentially run Envelop, although this is essentially just a big missing. Although, if you do time it correctly, this could absolutely wipe an enemy board and win you the game. And then something you're actually going to see in a few of these games is Night Hunters. I was messing around with Night Hunters because I felt like I wanted a fourth countermeasure. So I had 1 copies of Night Hunters within the deck at one point, but in the end I've opted for other options because I've ended up including more draw since I was running Night Hunters, and it just overall isn't as needed. On the US side, I don't think there's as much room for changes. I think that the current setup I have is pretty set in stone, outside of maybe cutting the Avenger if you wanted that 3rd War Bonds. Or maybe you could cut down 1 weekend, do it for another War Bonds, although that does lower the amount of healing you have. But otherwise, I don't think there's a lot of options to really mess around with. I think one of the biggest ones could be Carrier Cover, which is able to bounce a unit or ramp us. But it does compete with the 332nd Engineer for very tight deck slots. Torpedo Attack's also another option, is decent removal. But again, we have a lot of removal already, and this is very restrictive if the enemy deck does not take the front line. Otherwise, there's not a whole lot here. Mobilization could be something if you want card draw, but I feel like we need the We Can Do It's instead. And beyond that, there's not a whole lot. So that's the deck. Let's talk about Mulligan before we actually get into the games. So for the Mulligan, I generally tend to look for early game plays. Stuff like ARADO, Lurking Danger, and United We Stand, and the 115 are probably the best ones to look for. Those are just naturally pretty good. If you know you're going up against aggro, or you have a feeling you are, I would also consider keeping stuff like 1097th and FLAMMPANZER, as both of those are very effective at stopping aggro. If you're playing against slow decks, I would recommend looking to keep stuff like your ramp cards, like 332nd Engineer, and even something like War Bonds, because those will be the most important. Stuff also like the Panzer III-H is also good to keep in slower matchups, so you're able to better tutor and find what you need when you need it. And otherwise, the game plan is essentially just grind the enemy out. You're looking to ramp up in credits, and then you're going to play big threats, and you're going to have a lot of credits to work with throughout the game, so you're able to afford many of these big threats effectively. And even just having 13 or 14 credit slots can help a lot in your flexibility and making combos with like drawing and also playing units out and all that. It can be very effective. Main thing is just watching out for your threat density, because the deck can be a little light, at least the current iteration is, but maybe we'll see an upgraded version that has a bit more threat density that doesn't need to be as careful with its assets. But otherwise, let's just get into those games. And we are back after those multiple games. As you saw, the deck actually did pretty amazingly well at dealing with aggro decks. It tackled a wide variety of them and really shut them down. And that's just because our deck is so full of interaction early on that there's just not a whole lot the enemy can do. The only thing that potentially can really disrupt this is certain explosive turns ones, like Zukov into the Cossacks on turn 1. That's pretty nasty, but to be honest, almost every deck suffers after that. But otherwise, this deck is very good against anti-aggro. And as you saw, it is possible to overcome slower decks, although you definitely have to be careful. Again, maybe the deck list down in the description might have an additional threat here or there that the games I was playing with didn't have, so you might have a little bit easier time overcoming enemies. But overall, I do really like this deck. It is fun and interactive, very well-rounded, I think, with the biggest weakness maybe being a little light on the healing, which forces us to have some maybe less than optimal options in our ally slots. But otherwise, the deck feels pretty powerful, and at the very least is a fun alternative to the standard US ramp decks that everybody's pretty much been playing since the patches come out. But otherwise, that's going to be it for today. I want to thank you all so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe and like the video. Also, let me know down in the comments below what you'd like to see next. Is there, maybe suggest a deck I could try out, or maybe we can even do deck doctors if you're interested in those. If you have a deck you want me to look at, maybe I can help you give feedback and make it a more effective deck. Whole lot of different, I'm open to anything really, I'm just interested in what you guys want to see, or if you're enjoying the content. But otherwise, that's all I have. Thank you so much for watching, and have a good day.